Okay, we are going to start our new unit on the cell, and we're going to focus basically on what it looks like and what the jobs are of the different components in the cells. In this first lecture, though, we're going to just go a little bit into some of the history behind how we know what we know about the cell. So let's get started. So, just like anything, you need to discover it, right? It's not like people just knew what cells were. And the problem with cells is they're microscopic, right? They're tiny, so you can't see them. Like, for example, we're made of cells, but when you look in the mirror, you don't see the individual cells, you just see you. And that's what life is. Life is made up of cells, but unfortunately, not unfortunately, because it would look really weird if we could see all the cells, but because, you can't just see a cell, it took a long time for people to realize that life is actually built out of cells. And the first person to really even think about this in terms of there being a cell was a gentleman by the name of Robert Hooke. And in the 1600s, he really was the one to pioneer this technology that we know of today called the microscope. The microscope didn't really exist in the form that we know today until Robert Hooke went ahead and developed this microscope. And this is a picture here of his microscope, and it's called a compound microscope. So when you compound something, you add them together, right? So a compound is when you add multiple things together. So what a microscope is it's actually a pretty simple piece of equipment. You've all held up a magnifying glass before, right? It's a piece of glass that has been bent in a way that it magnifies an image when light hits it. So when you look through a magnifying glass, it magnifies something like maybe 10 times. Well, if you take two magnifying glasses and hold them up to each other, it magnifies it twice, and that's essentially what a microscope is. So if you take a look here, you can see whatever the person is trying to look at, they would put down here in the specimen holder. Light would be shined on it from this little device here. This was just an oil lamp to give light. And then this would be the actual microscope here, where you have one magnifying glass would be in the eyepiece, and the second one would be down here in the barrel, and then you could focus that image in a way that you could see it at a very high magnification. And he did that, and he started looking at stuff. And what he found was there was something that was always true. When he looked at certain things, like for example, he looked at cork, and cork it's a type of wood. It's a very lightweight wood. You've all seen cork before. You put it in the bottle, right? A cork is how you cork a bottle. And what he saw when he looked under the microscope at cork is he saw something that looked like this. And what this was basically, this would be in the microscope, and he saw something that looked like a bunch of boxes. And he didn't know what they were at the time, but what he figured out was, okay, well, these little individual pieces must be what this cork is made out of. And it reminded him of the rooms that you would find in a seminary, which is where priests go to become priests, and they call those rooms cells. Now, we call prison cells cells, but at the time, when he was around in the 1600s, those were the name for rooms. And he thought it looked like there was a bunch of empty rooms, so he called them cells. So Robert Hooke actually is the person that coined that phrase of cells. And he was the person to really first do that. The second person to come along just years after Robert Hooke was Anton van Leeuwenhoek, right? And he was actually not even a scientist. He dealt with fabric. He made fabrics. And when you work with fabrics, you need to see things at a small scale. So he would use microscopes. He would use that technology to look at his fabric. And then he just a curious individual, and he started looking at all kinds of stuff under his microscope. And he was the first person to actually see living organisms at the microscopic level. He looked at pond water under his microscope, and what he found were these little things swimming around. And those little things, we know now, are one-celled organisms like paramecia and amoeba, but he called them animalcules because he thought they looked like little tiny animals, and they were microscopic. So he was the first person to really say, all right, well, cells exist, and they're live. They're moving around, and they're doing their thing. So he was a very important person in terms of understanding what cells are. And then finally, we have the two gentlemen that came up with something called the cell theory, Schleiden and Schwann. And they were German scientists, and they came up with something called the cell theory. So what is a cell, right? What a cell is it's the basic unit of life. So if you took anything living and broke it down to its most basic form, it's a cell. And that cell is the functional part of a living organism. And then if you have a more complex organism, you add cells. But an individual cell is still a living organism. So they came up with this thing called the cell theory. And the cell theory is the idea that there's three general rules about cells. The first one is that anything alive is made of cells. All things that are living are made of cells. You could have a single-celled organism, which is bacteria would be a single-celled organism. Paramecia, viruses aren't technically living, so we wouldn't consider them a single-celled organism. The second rule of the cell theory is that cells are the basic units of structure and function. Well, what the heck does that mean, right? What that means is the cells are the units that determine what something looks like and what it does. So if I come back to this image over here, I drew this the other day. This might look a little familiar. When you look at a cell, you probably think of a cell looking something like this over here. And that would be a cell. You know, it's blobby, it's got its nucleus in there, it's got its different parts. Now, here's the thing about cells, though. They come in all different shapes and sizes. And what determines its shape and size is what it does. So, for example, this one over here is a neuron. And neurons are huge cells. They have these long axons. And they look the way they do because their job is they take information from over here and they send it all the way down to over here. So our neurons have the job of sending information. So they're long and thin, right? And that makes sense. This over here, these would be cells you would find in your intestinal tract. So for example, if I were to draw, the rest of the cells here, this would be like the intestinal wall. So if you know anything about your intestines, they are long tubes essentially, so this would be both sides, and food would travel through here. And the whole job of your intestines is to break down food particles into small enough sizes that they can get absorbed, and then your cells along the intestine have these little things that are called microvilli, and they're like little tiny fingers, and their job is they absorb. So think of them like sponges. They absorb the nutrients and put them into the body so that way you can use them. So they look different than neurons because they have a different job. And this last cell over here, this long thin cell, would be an example of what our muscle cells look like. Our muscle cells are long thin tube-like cells, and they attach to different, so like for example, there'd be a bone over here, right? So let's say this is your leg bone and this is your other leg bone. I know this is not a realistic drawing, but let's say you have two bones here. What ends up happening is when this muscle contracts, it gets smaller. And that's what muscles do. They get smaller. And when it contracts, just like playing tug of war, they're pulling these two bones towards each other. And that's how movement works. Your muscle contracts and your body moves. So the shape, size, everything about a cell determines what it does, and that is what that statement means. That second idea of the cell theory. Cells are the basic units of structure and function. Structure is what it looks like. Function is what it does. So the cell determines what it looks like and what it does. And finally, all cells are produced by existing cells. One cell divides into two cells. That's how it works, right? And that is why viruses are not technically living. So we're dealing with a virus right now. And the way that virus works is it injects its DNA into a living cell and it takes over that cell. But a virus by itself can't replicate. And that's why if you totally avoid that virus and it can't attack something, it will eventually die off because it can't replicate by itself. It needs to inject its DNA into another organism. And I'm going to finish up here with the last little concept, and that is this idea of prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. There are two types of cells when we're talking about something called the nucleus. And a prokaryote, pro means before, karyo actually means genetics. Karyo, like we're going to talk about that later on, or genetic material. So in a prokaryotic cell, there is no nucleus. The DNA is in the cell, but it kind of just floats around. It's not very protected. So these are cells that are very basic. Bacteria are a great example of prokaryotes. They are very simple organisms. They just have basically DNA and a protein coat to protect what's inside, and then they just replicate. Okay, we are way more complex, so we can't function that way. But prokaryotic cells are cells that do not contain a nucleus. And the whole point of a nucleus is it protects the DNA. So these would be cells that replicate quickly, but they also mutate quickly. And we'll talk more about that later. So a prokaryotic cell does not have a nucleus. This would be a picture of a prokaryotic cell, like a bacteria. It's got its outer cell membrane, it's got it's got a cell wall in there to protect it, but the actual DNA is just floating around in the nucleus. There's not a whole lot, not very complex. A eukaryotic cell, U means true. So a eukaryotic cell is a true genetic cell in the sense that these are much larger, but really what makes these different is they have a nucleus. The DNA is contained inside of a nucleus, and they also have a whole bunch of these specialized little structures that we call organelles. And each one of those organelles has a job. Bacteria have some of those organelles, but eukaryotic cells have a lot of different organelles. So these are going to be much more complex. You can have a single-celled eukaryotic organism, or you can have a multi-celled eukaryotic organism. You can't have a multi-celled prokaryotic organism. They only come as a single cell. But eukaryotic cells are much more complex. So if you take a look here, you can see this is a much more complex cell. That's your nucleus with your DNA in there, but then there's all these other very, very complex structures because eukaryotic cells are just more complex than prokaryotic cells. Thank you very much.